Welcome to Module 4 and welcome to Gesture Drawing Foundations. In this module, we're going to look at what gesture is, the kinds of gestures, the kinds of ways we want to see gestures in gesture drawing, and really just understand what is gesture. What is gesture? So a lot of the time when you think about gesture drawing, you probably have this idea in your mind that people are doing kind of life drawings, maybe life drawings from photos or life drawings from real models. But the truth really is that those artists are attempting to try to capture the essence or the core of the pose. And that really is what gesture drawing is, capturing the core or the essence of the figure, of the form. But more importantly, once you understand how to capture it and how to see it, that you will then be able to utilize this knowledge to give your characters feeling and emotion and life. Because this course obviously isn't a figure drawing course, it's a character drawing course. And characters are very much full of personality, full of life. They can relate to one another, they can relate to the viewer, and people just feel inspired and motivated, and they believe in this sort of life that you're putting into the page. So gesture is very, very, very important. A good way to think about gesture sort of at its core is that it really is the soul, the point, the entire kind of overall message or structure of a pose or of a character's sort of emotions in a sense. It's the core, it's kind of the foundation of it. And you'll hear me using different words like this, core and essence and directional flow and things like that when we talk about gesture. So gesture is very, very important. And gesture falls into the shape category. So it's very much falling into a kind of compositional category. When looking at it in terms of a strictly drawing type of sense, it would fall into shape. It's got everything to do with how we think about dynamic shapes, how we structure the foundations or the shape composition of the pose and things like that. So it's important to remember that it falls into shape. So the way we're going to be learning about gesture is, instead of just having this kind of vague idea where we're going to be drawing figure drawings or photos, we're going to learn gesture in four ways, right? And the first way is directional flow shapes. Now, as we've learned, we know that sort of static shapes, they don't seem to have any directionality, but when we bend them, we can give them a sense of directionality. So the first way we will be learning about gestures is by doing directional flow gestures. And I'll do an example over here so that we can get a sense of what that's going to be like. So directional flow gestures would be just focusing really on flat shapes and not thinking too much about forms and just feeling out the gestures. So I'll just do something very basic here. And you may be recognizing some of these general, some of this general flow from us doing the form module in module 3. So this would be directional flow shapes. Let's call it directional flow shapes. Or really just shape gestures. So we're not thinking about form. And this is really important that we grasp this, that we're understanding that we're grabbing this type of silhouette that's just very flat, but still very readable types of shapes and directional flow shapes, right? And then we'll be doing dynamic form gestures. So we'll kind of take our directional flow shape gestures here, and we will then add form onto them, which we hopefully know how to do. And I'm going to actually put this in a different color, and we'll start building those basic forms on top of the gestures and kind of imagining all of our structures. Put some center lines there so that we can get that sense that the forms are based on the directional flow, the energy kind of flow gestures, right? Directional energy and the directional movement, kinetic energy through the forms. So then here we have form-based gesture. And then we'll be doing anatomical gestures, where we're going to combine our shape and our form knowledge, and we're hopefully going to then use our anatomical knowledge that we learn from the reference material to build on top of what we have here I'm just going to lighten this a little bit. And we'll then start utilizing the reference and building anatomy on top of these structures. Obviously, I'm doing this out of my head here, but I'm going to imply some anatomical forms here. The pecs and the pelvis. Okay, so we want to grasp gestures from a fundamental perspective first before we start getting into doing crazy hardcore life drawings where, you know, if you had to just start out with that without any decent fundamental knowledge, you would probably not be very successful for a long time, and you'd waste a lot of time trying to figure out why you weren't being very successful. So this would be our anatomical gestures, where we're looking at references and drawing out those gestures, and we will certainly get into that in the next few lessons. And then last but not least, we will then do life gestures, right? Life gesture drawing. You might be like, well, what the heck is that? Well, once we know the shape and the form, and we have a good understanding of the anatomy of the gestures, and we've also been doing our daily anatomy studies, then we can actually move into life-based gestures, where we're looking at people and we're doing that typical thing maybe where you sit at the coffee shop and you're looking at people walk by and you're trying to capture the entire gesture of the person as quickly as possible. So for example, a typical life-based gesture might be something like this, and it's not really, I'm not doing some crazy drawing here, but let's see, I'm going to draw something like this and maybe something like that, and quickly just doing almost a scribble if you wish, but just trying to get the gesture. And we have an old lady with a stick, or an old man with a stick, or what have you. And these are sort of life-based gestures or life gestures where we're trying to quickly capture overall forms of things. For example, perhaps a man waiting at a bus stop might look something like this. Maybe he's got a sling bag on him. He's quite a broad man. He's wearing a hat. So these are really the life gestures. So we want to think of gestures in these categories. So let's just take a look at them one more time. We have our shape-based gestures, which are what we're going to be learning first, then form, then anatomical gestures, and then we're going to look at life gestures. And all of this gesture work is done from life. We want to learn gesture from life so that when we're drawing imaginatively, we have strong foundations in how to capture those movements and the energetic feeling and the dynamic flow of the human forms in those characters. And even more so, once again reiterating that we want to then be able to imbue how the character's feeling, what the character is thinking, and then utilize what we know of gesture to better communicate these aspects of our characters, who our characters are, how they're feeling, what they're doing, what they're anticipating, and so on and so forth. Last but not least, and this is a very important point that I want you to remember throughout your drawing career, hopefully for the rest of your life, but especially while we're doing this module. And it's really one of the main fundamental points of gesture drawing, is that you need to exaggerate the gesture, right? Exaggerate the gesture. And the reason you need to exaggerate it, particularly just the basic gesture of the form, is when you're doing a drawing and you're kind of getting your dynamic forms going and you're doing like a cool, you know, you're trying to get all these kind of nice dynamism happening in the piece and so on. If you don't tilt things enough, twist things enough, do adequate rotations and push the actual pose, push the pose and really try and make it as exaggerated as possible, not overly exaggerated, but fairly exaggerated. What happens is when we get to the cleanup stage, where we're now putting in some clean lines and we're detailing and we're drawing the face and we're drawing the anatomy in and the clothes and the hair, what happens is if the gesture is not exaggerated enough underneath, then when you start adding the details and adding the anatomy and the clothes and the accessories and all the other elements to the character, it can tend to kill the gesture a little bit. So basically adding details and adding these elements kills or really tones down the initial gesture. That's why it's important that we need to exaggerate the gesture a little bit. So that we are compensating for that sort of toning down effect that adding detail can have to a character drawing. Okay, so remember, exaggerate the gesture, and you will see, maybe even if you've exaggerated a little too much, that when you do start adding the details tend to really tone the gesture down quite a bit. So very important point, exaggerate the gesture. Let's not forget that. All right, that's the end of the intro to the module. Let's get into it.